Let's now discuss communicative language ability proposed by Bachmann. Communicative language ability involves knowledge or competence and the capacity for executing or implementing that knowledge in proper contextualized communicative language use. So, knowledge or the competence and the execution or implementation of that knowledge in a proper contextualized communicative language use. So we see that communicative language ability consists of the language competence as well as the execution and implementation of that knowledge in the language use. Knowledge of the language and its appropriate use in a given context that form the core basis of this particular approach. Lyle Bachmann, one of the leading theorists in the field of language testing. Basically, he has specialties or the expertise in the area of language testing. And he proposed communicative language ability that in order to assess communicative competence, this calls for the ability as a core component. Distinguishes between knowledge, that is the grammatical knowledge, and skills, the ability to use that knowledge. Attempts to characterize the processes by which the various components interact with each other and with the context in which language use occur. So basically the interaction among different components as well as the context in which those components are to be used. That is also one of the key area of this particular approach, which is communicative language ability. Bachmann proposed 4 components of communicative language ability. Knowledge, language competence, then you have strategic competence, then psychophysiological mechanism, and context of situation. Now, language competence refers to the knowledge of language. Strategic competence is the capacity for implementing the components of language competence in contextualized communicative language use. Psychophysiological mechanism is something which enables the actual execution of language as a physical phenomena. And the world knowledge, basically, Bachmann conceives that the strategic competence is also affected by the knowledge structure of the world and the world knowledge of language user. Bachmann classifies the components called language competence in 2 divisions. You have organizational competence, which has grammatical competence and textual competence. And the second is pragmatic competence, which you have elocutionary competence, socio-linguistic competence. So these are the 2 broader categories. One is organizational competence and second is pragmatic competence. And then under them you have further subdivision of grammatical and textual competence under organizational and elocutionary and socio-linguistic competence under textual competence. Now, although the major components are there and then they are further divided into other but then we have other subdivisions under even the subdivision of these major components. So let's see what these subdivisions and major divisions are. So if we look at this image, we see that it is language competence and it has organizational competence and pragmatic competence. But then they are further divided into grammatical competence and textual competence, the organizational competence, and the pragmatic competence is divided into elocutionary competence and socio-linguistic competence. Under grammatical competence, you have further subdivisions in terms of vocabulary, morphology, syntax, phonology that constitute the grammatical competence, and the textual competence is cohesion and rhetorical organization. So when we look at the textual competence, we see that this competence includes the knowledge of conventions, basically for joining utterances together to form a text, which is essentially a unit of a language. It can be written, it can be spoken. And we see that text consists of two things, cohesion and rhetorical organization. By cohesion, we mean it's the explicit way of making semantic relationships such as reference, substitutions, ellipses, conjunction, etc. And rhetorical organization basically involve common methods of development such as narration, description, comparison, classification, and all that. Now, this is basically organizational. Now, coming to the pragmatic competence, we see that illocutionary competence is the ideational, manipulative, heuristic, imaginative. Ideational is what we mean by expressing expressing propositions, information, or maybe feelings. And we are talking about manipulative. That means something which is affecting the world around us, or we can manipulate, we can sort of interpret and create data according to our own will. Then you have heuristic. That is extending our knowledge of the world. Then you have imaginative. That is maybe aesthetic use of language or humorous use of language, basically based on the imagination. Now, coming to the socio-linguistic competence, you have the dialect, register, naturalness, and cultural aspect. Socio-linguistic competence is defined as the sensitivity to or control of conventions of language use and are determined by the features of the specific language context. And in that specific language context, you have different dialects, register, the naturalness of the speakers of that particular culture, and the norms of that particular culture reflected in the language. Another aspect of language competence proposed by Bachman is strategic competence. Although he feels that this particular competence is outside the domain of language competence, but yet it interacts with all the components of language competence. Now, there are three components of strategic competence. One is assessment component, which refers to basically identifying the kind of information that is needed, and also deciding the language competency, what is important. Then evaluating the success of your competency. Then planning component is basically selecting any channel or looking at the accuracy or the relevancy of a particular channel or assembling the utterances. Then execution component is basically the use of psychophysical mechanism for language use. To conclude, Lyle Bachman's communicative language ability model based on organizational competence and pragmatic competence involves knowledge of competence and the ability for executing or implementing that knowledge appropriately in a given cultural context.